Mediterranean Sea, the 9th of July, 1943. Warships sail north with 160,000 Allied troops. But only if the sea is calm can they land, and a great operation is in jeopardy. The aim at last is Fortress Europe and a foothold on the southern tip of Sicily. At midnight, the storm eases off. The invasion will go in at dawn. The British 8th Army will land on the right. The Americans will land on the left. The untried Canadian 1st Division will land in the center. The storm that might have stopped them had reassured the enemy. Relaxing, he was caught off guard. The 1st Division walked into Europe. At home, the ones who knew waited anxiously for the news.
The Prime Minister, the Right Honourable W.L. Mackenzie King, has an important message for the people of Canada.
Early on this morning of July the 10th, Allied forces, under the command of General Eisenhower, began landing operations in Sicily. All Canada will be justifiably proud to know that units of the Canadian Army are a part of the Allied force engaged in this attack.
The Canadians were now members of the famed 8th Army. For veterans of the Desert War, dust and heat were not new. But for the Canadians, they'd come direct from 3 damp years in England. The enemy retreated to be searched out. When seen, he quickly surrendered. Italians and Sicilians manned the coast, but all they wanted to do was go home. After only 2 days, the coastal defenders surrendered to the Canadian commander, General Guy Simonds. But the German was still ahead. The advance was pushed. 3 days of dust, 8 hours of sleep, and then a rest before the heavy fighting. Rocks and hills replaced the dust. The approach was to the mountains. The Germans held the high ground around Mount Etna. The Americans would sweep the left, and the British on the right advance across the plain. It was for the Canadians to crack the center. The Canadians must fight uphill, but they had allies above the German. The British, Americans, and Canadians controlled the Sicilian sky. These towns were built 1,000 years ago, perched on the hilltops for their defense in war. In this fight, too, the towns were the last prize. In Leonforte, Asoro, Regalbuto, the retreating German fought from street to street. Many of them were left behind, but they exacted their price for Sicily. After 10 days, Canadians won through to Agira. They were hailed not as conquerors, but as liberators. Now they must care for the half-starved people. The 1st Division was no longer untried. Their first performance had been closely watched.
I regard you now as one of the veteran division of the 8th Army. Just as good as anyone else, if not better. That people in Canada, in your home country, will know how proud they should be of what you've done here fighting overseas.
In Canada, Quebec is host to the leaders of the West. For the first time, they meet while their troops fight on enemy soil. Sicily is theirs, and now mainland Europe must be next. The major assaults are planned, and there are lessons to be learned from Sicily. At the meeting's end, President Roosevelt comes to Ottawa.
Today, in devout gratitude, we are celebrating the brilliant victory won by British and Canadian and American fighting men in Sicily. We have arrived harmoniously at certain definite conclusions. Of course, I am not at liberty to disclose just what these conclusions are, but in due time, we shall communicate the secret information of the Quebec Conference to Germany, Italy, and Japan. We shall communicate this information to our enemies in the only language that twisted minds seem capable of understanding.
8 days later, the liberators of Sicily crossed the narrow straits of Messina. They landed at Reggio on the toe of the Italian boot. Again, as in Sicily, Italians manned the coast. Bomb and barrage had done their work. Hardly a shot was fired. The town lay open, shocked, and silent. The Italians were happy to surrender. Again, the German withdrew. He demolished all behind him. Nothing that might impede pursuit was left undone. The advance depended now upon the engineers. The pressure of pursuit must be maintained, lest the German form up in strength across the narrow boot. On September 7th, the world heard the news.
This is General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The Italian government has surrendered its armed forces unconditionally.
The announcement was timed to coincide with the great new assault from the sea. It was hoped it would undermine German morale. The hope was vain. Salerno was a bloody struggle. The German, it was clear, had no thought of giving up Italy. He even took time for a daring mission to a prison on a hill. The deposed Italian leader Mussolini was set free. The first fascist of Europe, he had been the first to fall. His savior and last hope was Adolf Hitler. Hitler promised, "Italy shall be a major battleground." Rapidly, they built their strength. Their commanders were clever and tough. Kesselring and Rommel, the Desert Fox. Their plan was to mount a line across the Boot, where the land was narrow, the mountains high, the rivers swollen. The British had landed at Taranto and held their ground. The Americans and British were still fighting at Salerno. The Canadians helped to relieve the pressure by taking Potenza. Then on through the hills to Campobasso. In these hills, this modern army must rely on the lowly mule. On October 13th, they came to the end of this hard road. They gave it a new name, Maple Leaf City. It had baths and beds and movies of a girl from Winnipeg. For some, it was only a matter of days. The 1st Division was moving on. General Chris Vokes, the new commander, would lead them to the hardest test they had ever faced. The anchor of the German line on the Adriatic must be dislodged. The Canadians must cross the Sangro, then the Moro, to San Leonardo and Ortona. Tomorrow, Kesselring sent in fresh and determined troops. Germans held for 4 days in constant fighting. The Canadians regrouped. The guns laid down a barrage, and through the night, the forward troops went in. At dawn, the word came back. They'd crossed the Morro. In strong points still, the Germans held. A crossroads was the key. Casa Berardi fell to the Canadians. The men now looked to a gully swarming with more fresh Germans. The watches were set for dawn. A great artillery barrage was planned. It would be called Morning Glory. Morning Glory did its work. The gully was overrun. The way lay open to Ortona. Into this town, the Germans fell back, and these were Germans of the 1st Parachute Division. The town would be defended. The worst was still ahead. At home, Canadians listened for the voice of their great war correspondent.
This is Matthew Halton of the CBC, speaking from Italy.
By shortwave radio, his reports came from the heart of the battle.
We used to say, and it was true, the German was a good soldier. But that as soon as our chaps got on top of him, he gave up. That's not true here. Here we fight till we kill them. They're Germans, but I admire their guts. I'll say this. I'm very proud because my men are better than the Germans here. Remember, we attack, they defend, but how they defend. Today, I spent several hours in Ortona. If it wasn't hell, it was the courtyard of hell. It was a maelstrom of noise and hot, splitting steel. Our tanks in the square seemed to be ripping the town to pieces. And the enemy's anti-tank shells and mortars were crashing into the buildings everywhere.
Called it Little Stalingrad, and from their experience here would instruct the Allied armies on the craft of street fighting. The thing to do, they found, was to fight from house to house, blasting their way along through holes blown in walls. Germans countered, mining the houses and waiting. A battle of dynamite resulted. A cat and mouse game where it seemed no place was safe. lasted with no pause by day, with uneasy nights of patrol for a full week. On December 28th, the Canadians discovered that the Germans had withdrawn in the night. The ruin of Ortona had not been caused by shell or bomb. This town, they said, had been blown down by hand. The Canadians had faced the best the Germans had, and they had beaten these Germans. But in the month of December 1943, 3,000 Canadians were killed or wounded.
Of the CBC reporting from the Italian front. For the dead of Ortona, the bell of its cathedral, the Cathedral of St. Thomas the Apostle, tolls. For the Canadians who died in taking the town, and for the dust and ashes of the cathedral itself, the bell tolls.
The soldiers of Canada would move on to fight again. For those whose home had been Ortona, the ordeal of war at last was over.